Good morning and welcome to ASL's HR in 10.
At 10.
I'm Jason Perry.
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
And we're just here to bring you up to date with what's going on in the wonderful world of HR, which is never dull, is it, Kimberly?
Never a dull day, and particularly at the moment.
I kind of think with COVID case numbers as they are, we probably ought to start on a little bit of COVID this week. My own feeling is the numbers locally appear to be back at the kind of levels we saw in December and January. And anecdotally, we're hearing lots of stories of people not quite getting the rules right. And I think people are forgetting. Last year, we all knew what to do. This year, I think there's some problems, aren't there?
There are, yes. I think we need to do some back to basics advice. One of the things I've mentioned to you that has happened, I've spoken to a couple of people in the last few days who have been into work for a week with COVID because they thought they either had a cold or the flu. And I think it's important both individuals and employers recognise that anyone with anything, any form of ailment related to, runny nose, temperature, cough, must absolutely self-isolate from the beginning.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we probably ought to be looking at that I hoped would come out of this crisis is people would take a different approach to sick absence. It's easier for office jobs. I get that. We've all learnt we can work at home. So actually, there ought to be almost an automatic, I'm working from home today because I don't feel well, even if it's not obvious COVID symptoms.
Yes, although, if you say that you're off sick, there's a financial implication for individuals, depending on the the sickness policy that's in place for each organisation. A lot of people that we know locally, for example, they'd go straight onto statutory sick pay, and they would be really struggling financially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had one case this week I heard about where an employer became very, very nervous because he'd heard somebody had lost their sense of taste. And what actually had happened is, I think this individual had said their orange juice tasted funny or something. So we need to go back and almost remind people what to do, when to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, like we were talking about earlier, there's extremes, aren't there? There's people that are reacting too much and people that are reacting not enough.
Yes.
We need to get more people in the middle. So, my advice to clients is basically, if anybody has any sort of symptom, send them home, send them off for a test and see what happens from there.
Yeah.
If they get pinged, they have to self-isolate.
Yes.
Nobody else does.
Yes.
Just because you had a good story there, didn't you?
I had a call this morning from somebody who rang me up for advice because his boss had been pinged by the app yesterday and he wanted to know if he should self-isolate because he'd spent all yesterday with his boss. And the answer is no. The reality is your boss probably doesn't have COVID. The ping is a precaution, and a small percentage of those pinged will have COVID, but it's a precaution. His boss should probably be taking a lateral flow test every day, possibly even go and get a PCR test as a precaution. And now, if I were him, I would get a lateral flow test every day if I were cautious. But the reality is, because you know somebody who's been pinged does not mean you need to isolate. It just means you know somebody who might have been in proximity to the virus.
Yes, and I think for clarity, all people need to be aware of is if you've been pinged, you need to self-isolate.
Yes.
If you have been in contact with somebody who has subsequently contracted COVID in, obviously not 6 months ago, but recently, then you need to self-isolate.
Yes.
And that is as simple as that.
Yeah. And a word of best practice, I'd say, is if you have staff put phones in lockers, please get them to turn off their phone or put them, in Bluetooth safe mode, aircraft mode, whatever it is, to turn off the app whilst phones are sitting in lockers, because phones being next to each other all day in lockers will ping each other if one of those people tests positive a week later. So there's some simple guides on best practice as well, aren't there?
Yeah, is it worth reminding people also the penalties? So individuals that don't self-isolate when they should have potential criminal proceedings of some form.
Yes.
And employers that let people work when they potentially should be self-isolating or are ill face a fine of up between £1,000 and £10,000.
Yes. I mean, obviously, there's the let's say moral responsibility, the ethical responsibility to do it right. Yeah. But you're right. Above and beyond that, there are fines, there are charges for getting this wrong. So do please take this seriously. Let's move on a bit. It's interesting as we move on to that because I saw this lovely story. My Italian isn't very good, so I'm not going to try and pronounce this company name. But an Italian firm that have decided that where they have staff who are refusing the vaccine, they're putting them on 6 months paid leave.
I think that's a really interesting move. You know, a lot of people are going to be thinking, is that discriminatory? Is it not discriminatory? But absolutely, it speaks to protecting and duty of care to those vaccinated that want to be protected.
Yes. And do you know, it's the first case of anything like this I've seen. And it caught my interest because it struck me, actually, it would be very, very simple to say, if you don't want to vaccinate, then you can work from home for the next 6 months to anyone who has the ability to do that. I know there are plenty of environments that it's not possible, but we've proved in the past year just how much of the British workforce can work remotely. So maybe those people who don't want to vaccinate can be almost isolated from your workforce by sensible precautions.
You could take that a step further. I'm just thinking for some of our trades clients, for example, they're carrying on, they're all out on site and that kind of thing. And it makes me think, maybe they could have split up into teams of vaccinated teams of people working together and non-vaccinated teams of people working together.
Yes, that may actually cause a greater health risk, but I take your point. It does open up different lines of thinking. And what struck me is this Italian firm have looked at the numbers and they think it's only around 1% of their workforce. So they've costed it in and looked at and said it's a very small impact, but actually we want to keep our people safe. So if you don't want the vaccine, that's fine. We'll put you on 6 months paid leave, which might sound really, really good. I suspect in reality it's not, because it's probably to some extent career limiting, I would expect. So I kind of think it's a very positive step forward. For many it's too costly, I take that, but to move into a work from home for 6 months, if you want to do this, struck me as a really interesting way forward.
It definitely, and it reminds me of the research that we were talking about. Was it yesterday? Time flies. Was it 2/3 of HR people?
I know where you're going. The increased burden on HR.
Expect more work as a result of more remote working.
Yes.
That was my link there.
Totally.
Which I have to say, I thought it made me chuckle more than anything, because how can HR have any more of a hectic, more stressful workload? I'm so overwhelmed by this, can't even speak properly, than we have in the last 18 months. People have been working home for the last 18 months. How can it add to the workload any more than it already has?
You've kind of reminded me of that favourite quote of mine at the beginning of the year, which was from the HR director of a FTSE 100 company, who said, "No one better call us pink and fluffy after this year." And you're right, we've done so much in the HR profession to support, to facilitate, to ensure people are safe, to ensure best practice, and to interpret rules that really are far from clear. But I think as we continue on this, probably the better interpretation of that survey is it's just going to continue at this really bad rate for a little while to come. But you're right, we've had this increased burden, and the very fact we're talking about new ways to deal with people who are opposed to the vaccine kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
It does, yes. It's I think I'm actually going to slightly miss the days of, oh, there's a new law coming in tomorrow for employment related purposes. Oh, but we don't have any guidance or any instructions on how it should be implemented. Never mind, let's crack on regardless.
Under the circumstances, I think we've all done quite well. But
I think so.
yes, but look, this is, as I always say, HR in 10, and it's just been HR in 10 and a half. So we're about out of time. Lots of interesting stuff there. And I ought to remind people, we are live when we do this. So if you have an interesting question you'd like to put to either Kimberly or myself, do just type it in the YouTube chat box, and we'll do our very, very best to address it while we're on air. And if you like the content we put out, please click the subscribe to the ASL channel and follow it, and you'll get alerts when we're live. But for now, we say goodbye, and we'll see you again same time next week.
Goodbye. See you next week.
Thanks for watching.